Boat thief. Daniel Harper stood at the edge of the marina, the salty breeze tugging at his faded blue cap. The sun hung low over the horizon, casting golden streaks across the water, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. His boat, the Sea Whisper, bobbed gently against the dock, its sleek white hull gleaming in the late afternoon light. It wasn't just a boat to Daniel. It was his sanctuary, his pride, the result of years of sweat and savings. He'd spent countless weekends sanding the deck, tuning the engine, and perfecting every detail until it was exactly as he'd dreamed. At 24 feet, it wasn't the biggest vessel in the marina, but to Daniel, it was everything. He adjusted the ropes one last time, double-knotting them with the precision of a man who'd learned the hard way that the ocean didn't forgive carelessness. Satisfied, he stepped back, hands on his hips, and let out a contented sigh. This was his ritual, checking on the Sea Whisper after a long day at the hardware store where he worked. It was March 9th, 2025, and spring was just beginning to tease the air with warmth. The marina buzzed with the quiet hum of weekend boaters, the clink of metal against masts, and the distant cry of gulls. "Looking good, Dan," a voice called from behind him. Daniel turned to see his best friend, Ethan Carter, strolling down the dock, an iced coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. Ethan was the kind of guy who always looked like he'd just rolled out of bed, rumpled t-shirt, messy brown hair, and a grin that suggested he knew something you didn't. They'd been friends since high school, bonded over a shared love of the water and a mutual disdain for authority figures who didn't know what they were talking about. "Thanks, man," Daniel replied, brushing his hands on his jeans. "Just making sure she's ready for tomorrow. Thinking of taking her out for a spin." Ethan raised an eyebrow, taking a sip of his coffee. "You ever gonna let me drive that thing? I've got skills, you know." Daniel laughed. "Skills? Last time you helped me dock, we nearly took out Old Man Jenkins' fishing skiff." "That was one time," Ethan protested, but his grin widened. "Besides, I've been practicing. YouTube tutorials, my friend. I'm basically a captain now." "Yeah, I'll stick to being the captain of my own boat. Thanks," Daniel said, shaking his head. He glanced back at the Sea Whisper, feeling that familiar swell of pride. It wasn't just about the boat itself, it was what it represented. Freedom. Independence. A life he'd built from scratch after years of scraping by. Their banter was interrupted by a sudden commotion near the marina entrance. Daniel squinted, shielding his eyes against the sun, as a figure came barreling down the dock toward them. It was Tommy, one of the dock workers, a wiry kid in his 20s with a mop of red hair and a perpetual look of panic. Today, though, he was moving faster than Daniel had ever seen, arms flailing like he was trying to flag down a runaway plane. "Dan! Dan!" Tommy shouted, his voice cracking as he skidded to a stop in front of them. His face was flushed, his eyes wide with something between fear and disbelief. "Your boat, it's gone." For a heartbeat, Daniel's brain refused to register the words. "Gone?" he echoed, frowning. "What do you mean, gone?" "I just tied it up." Tommy gestured wildly toward the empty slip where the Sea Whisper had been moments ago. "I mean gone, man. It's not there. I saw it. I saw her take it." "Her?" Ethan cut in, lowering his coffee. "Who's her?" Daniel's stomach twisted as a horrible suspicion began to form. He whipped around, scanning the water beyond the dock, and there it was, his boat, cutting through the waves like a runaway horse. At the helm stood a woman in a wide-brimmed sun hat, her blonde hair whipping in the wind. She was gripping the wheel with one hand and waving at a passing boater with the other, as if she were some kind of maritime queen holding court. Music blared from the speakers, something upbeat and obnoxious, probably pop, and even from this distance, Daniel could see the chaos unfolding. "No," he breathed, his voice barely audible. "No way." Ethan followed his gaze, did a double take, and nearly dropped his coffee. "Wait, is that Lisa?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "Yeah, it's Lisa." Lisa Monroe was the neighborhood's walking disaster, a woman who radiated entitlement like it was a superpower. She lived 3 houses down from Daniel in their small coastal town, a place where everyone knew everyone and gossip spread faster than a rip current. Lisa had moved in 6 months ago, and from day one, she'd made it her mission to insert herself into every aspect of community life, whether people wanted her there or not. She was in her late 30s, always dressed in bright sundresses and oversized sunglasses, and had a voice that could carry across a football field. To most, she was an annoyance. To Daniel, she was a personal nightmare. It had started innocently enough. Lisa had wandered over one afternoon while Daniel was polishing the Sea Whisper at the marina, her hands clasped behind her back as she sighed dramatically. "Oh, what a beautiful boat," she'd said, her tone dripping with something that wasn't quite envy, but wasn't quite admiration either. "It's such a shame not everyone can afford one. I mean, it's almost unfair, don't you think? Some people just hoard luxury like that." Daniel had chuckled at the time, assuming she was joking. "Yeah, well, I worked hard for it," he'd replied, keeping it light. "Not exactly hoarding, just enjoying what's mine." Lisa had smiled then, a tight little smile that didn't reach her eyes, and walked off. But the comments didn't stop. Over the months, she dropped by whenever he was at the marina, always with some passive-aggressive remark about how boats should be shared with the community or how selfish it was to keep something so nice to himself. Daniel had brushed it off, figuring she was just lonely or bored. He never imagined she'd take it this far. "She stole it," Daniel said now, his voice low and dangerous. "She actually stole my boat." Tommy nodded, still panting from his sprint. "She told me she was just taking it for a quick ride. I thought she had your permission or something. She acted so confident." "A quick ride," Daniel repeated, incredulous. "That's what you say when you borrow a skateboard, not a damn boat." Ethan let out a low whistle, his eyes still locked on the Sea Whisper as it swerved dangerously close to another vessel. "Well, buddy, looks like you've got a problem. Lisa's out there living her best life, and your boat's along for the ride." Daniel's pulse pounded in his temples as he fumbled for his phone. He barely registered Ethan stepping closer, still clutching his coffee like this was some kind of spectator sport. "What's the plan, Captain?" Ethan asked, his tone half teasing, half serious. "The plan," Daniel gritted out, "is to get my boat back before she sinks it." He scrolled through his contacts, his thumb hovering over the marina security number before dismissing it. They were useless. Half the time, they were napping in the office. No, this called for the big guns. He hit the Coast Guard's emergency line and pressed the phone to his ear, his eyes never leaving the blonde menace at the helm of his pride and joy. As the line rang, Daniel muttered under his breath, "Lisa, you're gonna regret this." The phone buzzed against Daniel's ear, each ring stretching his nerves thinner. Out on the water, Lisa was turning the Sea Whisper into a one-woman demolition derby. She swerved between boats, ignoring the angry shouts of other boaters, her sun hat flapping like a flag of defiance. The music blasting from the speakers, some pop anthem about freedom and summer, only added to the absurdity. Daniel's stomach churned as he watched her nearly clip a small sailboat, its owner shaking a fist in her direction. "Come on, pick up," he muttered, pacing the dock. Ethan stood beside him, filming the chaos with his phone, a grin plastered across his face like he was at a comedy show. Tommy hovered nearby, wringing his hands, clearly regretting his role in letting Lisa anywhere near the boat. Finally, a voice crackled through the line. "Coast Guard, what's your emergency?" "My boat's been stolen," Daniel said, his voice tight with barely contained fury. The officer paused, as if making sure he'd heard correctly. "Stolen? Can you give me a description of the vessel?" "Yeah," Daniel snapped. "It's a 24-foot cruiser, white hull, named Sea Whisper. Right now, it's being driven by a lunatic in a sun hat who doesn't know what she's doing." Ethan choked on his coffee, coughing into his sleeve. "Did you just call her a lunatic to the Coast Guard?" Daniel shot him a glare, but didn't respond. The officer's voice remained calm, professional. "Do you know the individual operating the vessel?" "Unfortunately, yes," Daniel said. "Her name's Lisa Monroe. She's my neighbor. She took it without permission." Keys clacked on the other end of the line. "We're dispatching a patrol boat now. Can you confirm her location?" Daniel squinted at the water. Lisa was still weaving through the marina, now heading toward the open channel. "She's about 200 yards off the main dock, moving west. She's swerving like she's drunk, but I'd bet she's just clueless." "Is she armed?" the officer asked. Daniel watched as Lisa attempted a sharp turn, nearly taking out a dock piling. "Only with stupidity," he muttered. Ethan snorted, still recording. "Dude, this is gold. We're gonna be famous." "I don't care about fame," Daniel growled. I care about my boat. The officer came back on the line. We've got a team en route. Stay on the scene. We'll need your statement. Thanks, Daniel said, ending the call. He shoved the phone into his pocket and turned to Ethan. This is a nightmare. Ethan lowered his phone just long enough to take another sip of coffee. Nightmare? This is a gift. Look at her. She's a menace. You couldn't write this stuff. Daniel didn't reply. His eyes were locked on Lisa, who was now holding her phone aloft with one hand, snapping a selfie while steering with the other. The Sea Whisper tilted wildly, cutting through the wake of a passing fishing boat. The fisherman, a grizzled older man in a tiny skiff, had to dive overboard to avoid being mowed down. He surfaced a moment later, spluttering and shaking his fist. She's gonna kill someone, Daniel said, his voice hoarse. She doesn't even know how to steer. Tommy piped up, his face pale. I should have stopped her, man. She just walked up, said she was taking it for a spin, and hopped on like it was nothing. I didn't think. It's not your fault, Daniel cut in, though his tone was sharp. She's the one who stole it. Ethan raised an eyebrow. Still, Tommy, you didn't think to, ask me or Dan first? Tommy shrank back. She was so confident. I thought she was your friend or something. Friend, Daniel spat. She's been a pain in my ass for months. Always whining about how I should share the boat, like it's a freaking community pool. Ethan chuckled. Well, she's sharing it now, with the whole marina. Daniel didn't laugh. His mind was racing, replaying every interaction he'd had with Lisa. The sighs, the comments, the way she'd linger by the dock, watching him work on the Sea Whisper. He'd thought she was harmless, just an annoying neighbor with too much time on her hands. Now, as he watched her careen toward the channel, he realized he'd underestimated her. This wasn't just entitlement. This was insanity. I'm calling her husband, Daniel said suddenly, pulling out his phone again. Ethan frowned. Mark? You think he's gonna rein her in? He's the only one who might, Daniel replied. He scrolled to Mark Monroe's number, saved from a time when Mark had apologized for Lisa denting Daniel's truck with her SUV, and hit call. The line rang twice before Mark picked up, his voice weary. Hey, Dan. What's up? Mark, your wife stole my boat, Daniel said flatly. There was a long pause, followed by a groan that sounded like it came from the depths of Mark's soul. Oh God. You're serious? Dead serious. She's out there right now, swerving around the marina like she's in a bumper car. I've got the Coast Guard on it, but I thought you should know. Mark sighed. I told her to stay away from your boat. She's been obsessed with it ever since we moved here. I'll be right down. Thanks, Daniel said, hanging up. He turned to Ethan. Mark's on his way. Ethan grinned. Oh, this just keeps getting better. Shut up, Daniel muttered, but there was no heat in it. He was too focused on the Sea Whisper, praying it, and everyone else, would survive Lisa's joyride. The marina was alive with chaos now, a symphony of shouting boaters, churning water, and the distant wail of a siren as the Coast Guard mobilized. Daniel stood at the edge of the dock, his fists clenched so tight his knuckles ached. The Sea Whisper was a white speck against the gray-green waves, Lisa still at the helm, oblivious to the havoc she was wreaking. Her sun hat flapped wildly, a ridiculous beacon of her audacity, and every few seconds, she'd wave at someone like she was starring in her own private parade. Ethan, still filming, nudged Daniel with his elbow. You think she knows the Coast Guard's coming? Or is she too busy planning her next Instagram post? She doesn't know anything, Daniel muttered, his eyes narrowing. She's too busy pretending she's in control. Tommy hovered behind them, shifting his weight from foot to foot. I'm so sorry, Dan. I should have. Stop apologizing, Daniel snapped, then softened his tone. It's done. Just help me keep an eye on her until the Coast Guard gets here. Tommy nodded eagerly, as if relieved to have a task. Ethan, meanwhile, zoomed in on his phone screen. Oh man, she's doing a twirl now. Look at that. She's going to take out that buoy if she's not careful. Daniel's stomach lurched as the Sea Whisper veered sharply to the left, narrowly missing a small fishing boat. The fisherman, a weathered guy with a beard like steel wool, yelled something Daniel couldn't hear over the wind, but the gesture he made was universal. Lisa didn't even flinch. She was too busy posing for another selfie, one hand on the wheel, the other holding her phone at a jaunty angle. She's insane, Daniel said, his voice a mix of disbelief and fury. She's actually insane. Ethan grinned, undeterred. Insane's good for views, man. This is going to be legendary. Daniel didn't care about views. He cared about the Sea Whisper, his boat, his refuge, the one thing he built that no one could take away. Or so he'd thought. Now, watching Lisa treat it like a toy, he felt a helplessness that burned into anger. He'd tied those knots himself. He'd checked the engine, polished the hull, made sure every inch of it was perfect. And she just waltzed in and taken it. The sound of tires crunching on gravel pulled his attention back to the shore. Mark Monroe's beat-up pickup truck screeched into the marina parking lot, the door flying open before the engine even cut off. Mark stumbled out, his face a mask of exhaustion and resignation. He was a stocky guy in his early 40s, with thinning hair and the kind of posture that suggested he'd been carrying the weight of Lisa's antics for years. "Dan," Mark called, jogging toward the dock. "Where is she?" Daniel pointed wordlessly at the water. Mark followed his gaze, and his shoulders slumped even further. "Oh, hell? She really did it." "Yeah," Daniel said, his voice tight. "She really did." Mark rubbed his temples, muttering under his breath. "I told her not to mess with your boat. I told her 100 times. She kept saying it wasn't fair, you gotta have it all to yourself." "Not fair," Daniel echoed, incredulous. "It's mine, Mark. I paid for it. I maintain it. She doesn't get to decide, it's community property." I know," Mark said, holding up his hands. "She's just Lisa. You know how she is." "Yeah," Ethan chimed in, still filming. "A walking tornado. How do you put up with her, man?" Mark shot him a tired look. "You get used to it. Or you don't. I'm still figuring that out." Daniel didn't have time for sympathy. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he yanked it out, seeing the Coast Guard's number flash on the screen. "Yeah," he answered, pressing it to his ear. "Mr. Harper, this is Officer Torres," a crisp voice said. "We've got a visual on your vessel. Our patrol boat's closing in. Can you confirm the suspect's still operating it?" Daniel squinted at the water. Lisa was now weaving through a cluster of buoys, the Sea Whisper tilting dangerously with each turn. "Yeah, she's still at it. Blonde, sun hat, acting like she owns the place." "Got it," Torres replied. "She's not responding to our signals. We're moving to intercept." "Good," Daniel said. "She's gonna wreck it. Or worse, if you don't stop her soon." "We're on it," Torres assured him. "Stay where you are. We'll need you to ID her when we bring her in." "Trust me," Daniel said darkly. "I'm not going anywhere." He hung up and turned back to the water, where the Coast Guard's patrol boat was now visible, cutting through the waves with purpose. Its sleek gray hull and flashing lights stood in stark contrast to Lisa's reckless joyride. Daniel's heart thudded in his chest as he watched them close the gap, praying they'd get to her before she did any more damage. "She's toast," Ethan said, lowering his phone for a moment to sip his coffee. "Coast Guard doesn't mess around." Mark groaned. "She's gonna make this a circus. You watch." "She already has," Daniel muttered. He could see it now, Lisa arguing with the officers, waving her phone like it was a get-out-of-jail-free card. He'd dealt with her nonsense before, but this was a whole new level. She'd crossed a line, and there was no talking her way out of it this time. The crowd at the marina was growing now, drawn by the commotion. Boaters and dock workers lined the shore, some pointing, others whispering. A few had their phones out, filming just like Ethan. Daniel felt a flicker of unease. This wasn't just his problem anymore. It was a spectacle. And Lisa, oblivious as ever, was the star. "She's heading for the channel," Tommy said suddenly, his voice high with panic. "If she gets out there." "She won't," Daniel cut in, though he wasn't as sure as he sounded. The channel led to open water, where the Sea Whisper could pick up speed, and where Lisa's lack of skill could turn deadly. He clenched his jaw, willing the Coast Guard to move faster. Ethan zoomed in again. "Oh, she's yelling at someone now. Look, those guys in the pontoon boat are not happy." Daniel followed his gaze. Sure enough, Lisa had swerved too close to a pontoon loaded with a family, forcing them to veer sharply to avoid a collision. The dad was on his feet, shouting, while the kids clung to the railing. Lisa, unfazed, gave them a cheerful wave and kept going. "She's a menace," Daniel said, his voice low. "A damn menace." Mark nodded, his expression grim. "I'll talk to her when they bring her back. Try to get her to apologize." "Good luck with that," Ethan said, smirking. She's not exactly the sorry type. Daniel didn't respond. His eyes were locked on the Coast Guard boat, now within shouting distance of the Sea Whisper. He could hear the faint crackle of a bullhorn as an officer barked orders, but Lisa wasn't slowing down. If anything, she seemed to be speeding up, laughing like this was all a game. Come on, Daniel muttered, his hands balling into fists again. End this already. The Coast Guard patrol boat sliced through the water, its engines roaring as it closed in on the Sea Whisper. Daniel's heart pounded in his chest, a mix of dread and hope warring inside him. Lisa was still at the wheel, her blonde hair whipping in the wind, her sun hat somehow still perched on her head despite the chaos. The bullhorn crackled again, the officer's voice booming across the waves. Ma'am, this is the U.S. Coast Guard. Cut your engine and prepare to be boarded. Lisa's response was immediate and predictable. She turned toward the patrol boat, yanked off her hat, and started waving it like a flag, shouting something Daniel couldn't make out. Even from the dock, he could see the defiance in her posture, the way she squared her shoulders as if she could argue her way out of this. She's not stopping, Ethan said, his voice tinged with glee. She's actually arguing with them. Mark groaned, rubbing his face with both hands. Of course she is. She thinks she's untouchable. Daniel didn't say anything. His eyes were glued to the scene unfolding on the water. The Sea Whisper lurched forward as Lisa gunned the engine, a move so reckless it made his stomach drop. She was laughing, as if this were some grand adventure, not a felony in progress. The patrol boat adjusted course, flanking her now, its officers poised to act. She's gonna crash, Tommy whispered, his hands twisting together. She doesn't know what she's doing. She never did, Daniel muttered. He'd seen Lisa in action before, backing her SUV into his mailbox, borrowing a neighbor's lawnmower without asking, leaving Yelp reviews for local businesses that read like petty revenge novels. But this was beyond anything he'd imagined she was capable of. The Coast Guard tried again, the bullhorn blaring. Ma'am, cut your engine now, or we will use force to stop you. Lisa's response was to swerve again, this time nearly sideswiping a small speedboat. The driver, a sunburned guy in a baseball cap, leaned over the edge, screaming obscenities as he fought to regain control. Lisa waved at him, too, like she was apologizing with a smile, then went back to steering, or trying to. The Sea Whisper tilted dangerously, its hull scraping against a buoy with a sound that carried across the water like a gunshot. Daniel winced. That's gonna leave a mark. Ethan zoomed in, narrating under his breath. And here we have Lisa Monroe, future star of America's Dumbest Criminals, taking on the Coast Guard and losing spectacularly. Stop filming for 2 seconds, Daniel snapped, though he knew it was pointless. Ethan was in his element, and nothing short of a tsunami was going to pull him away from this. The patrol boat was close enough now that Daniel could see the officers moving, 2 of them preparing to board, their movements swift and practiced. Lisa, apparently realizing she couldn't outrun them, turned sharply again, aiming for the open channel. It was a desperate move, and it backfired almost instantly. The Sea Whisper lurched as she overcorrected, the bow swinging wildly toward a cluster of buoys marking the no-wake zone. Oh no, Mark muttered, his voice barely audible. She's gonna. Before he could finish, the Sea Whisper slammed into one of the buoys with an ear-splitting crunch. The impact jolted Lisa forward, her arms flailing as she nearly face-planted into the wheel. The boat rocked, its engine whining as it struggled against the sudden stop. For a moment, everything seemed to freeze, the crowd on the dock holding its breath, the Coast Guard pausing mid-maneuver. Lisa sprawled across the helm like a rag doll. Then she popped up, brushing her hair out of her face, and started yelling again. This is ridiculous. I was fine. She's not fine, Daniel said, his voice flat. My boat's not fine. Ethan doubled over laughing, nearly dropping his phone. Did she just say she was fine? She hit a buoy. The Coast Guard didn't waste time. Within seconds, the patrol boat pulled alongside the Sea Whisper, and 2 officers leapt aboard. One grabbed the controls, shutting down the engine, while the other approached Lisa, who was now on her feet, waving her phone in their faces. I have permission, she shrieked, loud enough for Daniel to hear from the dock. This is my neighbor's boat, and he said I could borrow it. Daniel's jaw dropped. She's lying. She's actually lying to them. Mark sighed, a sound so weary it could have powered a wind turbine. That's her go-to move. She'll say anything to get out of trouble. The officer, a tall woman with a no-nonsense stance, didn't flinch. She grabbed Lisa's wrist, pulling her away from the wheel as the second officer secured the boat. Lisa flailed, her voice rising to a pitch that could shatter glass. I was going to bring it back. It's not stealing if I bring it back. It's a borrow. Ethan lost it, clutching his stomach as he laughed. A borrow? Oh man, that's priceless. Daniel wasn't laughing. He was too busy staring at the Sea Whisper, now bobbing helplessly beside the patrol boat. The buoy had left a nasty dent in the hull, a jagged scar that would cost a fortune to fix. His hands shook as he fought the urge to jump into the water and swim out there himself. But he stayed put, knowing the Coast Guard had it under control, barely. The officers wrestled Lisa into submission, cuffing her hands behind her back as she kept up her tirade. This is an overreaction. I didn't hurt anyone. You can't arrest me for this. Reckless endangerment, the female officer said, her voice cutting through Lisa's protests. Unauthorized use of a vessel. Failure to comply. You're lucky we're not adding more. Lisa's jaw dropped, her eyes darting around as if expecting someone to swoop in and save her. When no one did, she turned back to the dock, locking eyes with Daniel. Even from this distance, he could feel the heat of her glare. You're really going to let them do this? She shouted, her voice carrying over the water. Daniel crossed his arms, his expression hard. You stole my boat, Lisa. What did you expect? She scoffed, yanking against the cuffs. Oh my God, it's just a boat ride. You're so dramatic. That did it. Something snapped inside Daniel, and before he could stop himself, he shouted back. You almost killed a fisherman, you crashed into a buoy, and now I've got to fix your mess. Dramatic doesn't cover it. The crowd on the dock murmured, a few people chuckling. Ethan, still recording, leaned toward Daniel. That's going in the highlight reel, buddy. The Coast Guard officers signaled to Daniel, one of them shouting, Sir, are you the owner? Daniel nodded, stepping closer to the edge. Yeah, that's me. Do you want to press charges? The officer called. Daniel didn't hesitate. Yes. Lisa's head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. What? Dan, come on, you wouldn't. Throw the book at her, Daniel said, his voice cold. He turned to the officer. She's not walking away from this. The officer nodded, and Lisa's protests escalated into a full-blown meltdown. This is unbelievable. You can't do this. I'll sue. Good luck with that, Ethan muttered, grinning like a Cheshire cat. As the Coast Guard hauled Lisa onto their patrol boat, her sun hat finally fell into the water, drifting away like a surrender flag. She was still flailing, still yelling, but the officers ignored her, their focus on getting the Sea Whisper back to shore. Daniel watched, his anger simmering into something closer to exhaustion. The worst was over, or so he thought. The patrol boat towed the Sea Whisper back to the marina, Lisa's voice still echoing across the water like a siren no one wanted to hear. Daniel stood at the dock's edge, his arms crossed, his pulse finally slowing as the adrenaline ebbed. The crowd had thickened now. Boaters, dock workers, even a few curious tourists drawn by the spectacle. Phones were out everywhere, capturing every second of Lisa's downfall. Ethan, of course, was still filming, his coffee long forgotten on a nearby bench. She's a natural performer, Ethan said, zooming in as Lisa tried to wrench her arm free from an officer's grip. Look at that, Oscar-worthy. She's a natural disaster, Daniel corrected, his eyes fixed on the Sea Whisper. The dent in the hull was worse up close, a gaping wound that made his chest tighten. He'd spent years perfecting that boat, and in less than an hour, Lisa had turned it into a repair bill he couldn't afford. Mark stepped up beside him, his face a mix of embarrassment and defeat. I'm so sorry, Dan. I don't even know what to say. You don't have to say anything, Daniel replied, his tone clipped. She did this, not you. Mark nodded, but the guilt didn't leave his eyes. She's always been impulsive. But this, I didn't think she'd go this far. None of us did, Ethan said, finally lowering his phone. Except maybe Dan. You've been calling her a menace for months. Daniel didn't respond. He was too busy watching the Coast Guard tie the Sea Whisper to the dock, the officers moving with the efficiency of people who'd done this 100 times. Lisa was still on the patrol boat, now seated on a bench with her hands cuffed behind her. Her hair was a tangled mess, her sundress rumpled, but she still managed to look indignant, her chin jutting out as she muttered to herself. The lead officer, a woman with short dark hair and mirrored sunglasses, hopped onto the dock and approached Daniel. "Mr. Harper." "That's me," Daniel said, stepping forward. "I'm Officer Riley," she said, her tone brisk but not unfriendly. "We've detained the suspect. She's claiming she had permission to use your vessel. Can you confirm that's not true?" Daniel snorted. "She didn't have permission. She stole it. I was standing right here when she took off." Riley nodded, jotting something on a clipboard. "That's what we figured. She's facing charges: unauthorized use, reckless endangerment, failure to comply. You still want to press additional charges?" Daniel glanced at Lisa, who was now glaring at him from the patrol boat. Her eyes flashed with a mix of rage and desperation, and for a split second, he almost felt sorry for her. Then he remembered the fisherman diving overboard, the dent in his boat, the sheer arrogance of her borrow excuse. "Yeah," he said firmly. "I do." Riley didn't blink. "Understood. We'll need you to fill out some paperwork, and we'll get your boat inspected for damages." "Thanks," Daniel said, his voice quieter now. He turned to the Sea Whisper, running a hand along the dented hull. It wasn't just metal and fiberglass to him. It was his freedom, his escape from a job he tolerated and a life that sometimes felt too small. Now it was battered, and Lisa didn't even care. Ethan clapped him on the back. "You're a legend, man. Standing up to her like that? People are going to talk about this for years." "I don't want to be a legend," Daniel muttered. "I just want my boat back in one piece." Mark cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. "I'll make sure she pays for the repairs, Dan. Whatever it costs." Daniel looked at him, skeptical. "You think she'll agree to that?" Mark's laugh was bitter. "She won't have a choice. I'm done letting her off the hook." Before Daniel could reply, Lisa's voice cut through the air again. "Todd. Todd, do something." Mark flinched, and Daniel realized she was calling him by a nickname, or maybe just getting his name wrong in her panic. Mark turned toward the patrol boat, his expression hardening. Lisa, just stop. You did this to yourself." Lisa's jaw dropped, her eyes widening in betrayal. "You're taking his side? Over me?" "Yeah," Mark said, his voice steady. "I am." The crowd murmured, a few people chuckling. Lisa's face twisted, and she lunged forward, only to be yanked back by Officer Riley. "This is ridiculous," she shrieked. "I didn't do anything wrong." "You nearly capsized a fishing boat," Riley said, her tone flat. "You hit a buoy, endangered other vessels, and ignored our orders. That's not nothing." Lisa crossed her arms, or tried to, with the cuffs, and huffed. "That's all technicalities. No one got hurt." Daniel stared at her, incredulous. "You're unbelievable." She glared back, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, please, Dan. It's just a boat. Get over it." That was the last straw. Daniel took a step forward, his voice rising. "It's not just a boat, Lisa. It's mine. You stole it. You trashed it, and you put people in danger. You don't get to act like this is my fault." Lisa opened her mouth to argue, but Mark cut in. "Enough, Lisa. You're not talking your way out of this." She turned to him, her eyes pleading. "Mark, honey." "No," Mark said, his tone final. "No more excuses." Lisa's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, she seemed to realize she was out of moves. She muttered something under her breath, probably, "This is so unfair," and sank back onto the bench, glaring at the world. Riley signaled to her team. "Let's wrap this up. Mr. Harper, we'll be in touch about the repairs." Daniel nodded, watching as the officers prepared to take Lisa away. Ethan leaned in, whispering, "Dude, this isn't over yet." "What do you mean?" Daniel asked, frowning. Ethan held up his phone, showing the screen. "I posted the video 15 minutes ago. It's already got 20,000 views." Daniel blinked, then a slow grin spread across his face. "You're kidding." "Nope," Ethan said, wiggling his eyebrows. "Lisa's about to be famous. And not in a good way." Daniel looked back at the patrol boat, where Lisa was still sulking. For the first time since this nightmare began, he felt a flicker of satisfaction. She'd made her bed. Now she'd have to lie in it, on the internet, for all the world to see. The next few days were a blur of phone calls, insurance forms, and repair estimates. Daniel spent hours at the marina, assessing the damage to the Sea Whisper with a mechanic who kept shaking his head and muttering about amateurs. The dent in the hull was fixable, but it wouldn't be cheap. Thousands of dollars, more than Daniel had lying around. He'd have to dip into his savings, the same savings he'd been building for a bigger boat someday. Every time he thought about it, his anger flared anew. But the real chaos wasn't the repairs, it was the aftermath. Ethan's video had exploded online, racking up millions of views overnight. People couldn't get enough of Lisa's borrow rant, her wild swerving, and the moment she crashed into the buoy. Comments poured in by the thousands. This is peak Karen energy. Who let her near a boat? I need this remixed ASAP. Sure enough, someone had turned her "It's not stealing if I bring it back" line into a catchy song, complete with auto-tune and a beat that made Daniel laugh despite himself. He was sitting on his couch one evening, scrolling through the latest batch of notifications, when Ethan burst through the door without knocking. "Dude, you're not gonna believe this." Daniel looked up, weary. "What now?" Ethan shoved his phone in Daniel's face. "The video's at 10 million views." 10 million. And counting. Daniel stared at the screen, where Lisa's furious face was frozen mid-shout. "Jesus, that's a lot." "A lot." Ethan laughed, flopping onto the couch beside him. "It's viral, man. People are making memes, GIFs, the works. There's one where she's superimposed on the Titanic. Iceberg? What iceberg?" And another with her yelling, "It's a borrow over a sinking ship." "You're famous." "I'm not famous," Daniel said, setting his phone down. "She is. And not for anything good." Ethan grinned. "True. But you're the hero of the story. The guy who stood up to the boat thief. People love that." Daniel snorted. "I didn't stand up to her. I called the Coast Guard." "Same difference," Ethan said, shrugging. "Point is, she's toast. Public humiliation's worse than any fine she'll get." Daniel couldn't argue with that. The internet had latched onto Lisa like a pack of wolves, tearing apart every detail of her meltdown. Her name was trending on X, alongside hashtags like #BoatKaren and #BorrowGate. Someone had even dug up her old Yelp reviews, complaints about a coffee shop that rudely refused to remake her latte 3 times, a florist who overcharged for roses and posted them for the world to see. It was a feeding frenzy, and Lisa was the main course. The next morning, Daniel got a call from Officer Riley. "Mr. Harper, just an update," she said. "MS. Monroe's been processed. She's facing fines, a 6-month boating ban, and 50 hours of community service." The judge wasn't impressed with her defense. "What did she say?" Daniel asked, curious despite himself. Riley's tone was dry. "Something about how it wasn't her fault because you didn't explicitly tell her she couldn't take the boat." Daniel laughed, a sharp, incredulous sound. "She's unbelievable." "Yeah," Riley agreed. "Anyway, your boat's cleared for repairs. Insurance should cover most of it, but you might need to front some cash." "Thanks," Daniel said, hanging up. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. It wasn't over, not really, but at least the legal part was moving forward. Now he just had to deal with the fallout. That afternoon, he headed to the marina to meet the mechanic. The Sea Whisper was up on blocks, its dented hull exposed like a patient on an operating table. He was running his hand along the damage when he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Mark approaching, his hands stuffed in his pockets. "Hey, Dan," Mark said, his voice subdued. "How's it going?" "Expensive," Daniel replied, nodding at the boat. "But it'll be okay." Mark nodded, then hesitated. "I talked to Lisa. She's not happy. But I told her she's paying for this. All of it." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "She agreed." "Not exactly," Mark admitted. "But she doesn't have a choice. I'm cutting her off until she does." Daniel studied him, surprised. "You're serious?" "Yeah," Mark said, meeting his gaze. "I've let her slide too long. This was the last straw." "Good for you," Daniel said, meaning it. "She needs to learn." Mark gave a small, tired smile. "We'll see. She's stubborn as hell." As Mark walked off, Daniel's phone buzzed with a text from Ethan. "Check X. She's trending again." He opened the app and saw a new wave of posts. People spotting Lisa at the grocery store, pointing and laughing. Others sharing screenshots of her trying to delete her old tweets. The internet wasn't letting go, and Daniel couldn't help but feel a grim satisfaction. She'd wanted attention. Now she had it. A week later, Daniel was at the marina, sipping coffee and watching the Sea Whisper get its first coat of primer. The repairs were underway, and though his bank account was lighter, he felt a weight lifting. The boat would be whole again soon, and that was what mattered. He was about to head home when he spotted her, Lisa, trudging down the dock with a bucket of cleaning supplies. She was dressed in an oversized hoodie, sunglasses, and a baseball cap pulled low, clearly trying to avoid recognition. It wasn't working. People whispered as she passed, a few snapping discreet photos. Her first day of community service had begun, and the marina was her punishment ground. She spotted Daniel and froze, her jaw tightening. Then, with a huff, she stomped over, the bucket rattling in her grip. "This is your fault," she hissed, keeping her voice low. Daniel raised an eyebrow, unfazed. "My fault? You stole my boat, Lisa." She scoffed, adjusting her sunglasses. "I wouldn't be here if it weren't for that stupid video. Everyone's laughing at me. I can't even go to the store without people staring." Ethan, who'd just arrived with a fresh coffee, grinned. "Yeah, that's what happens when you go viral for being a boat thief. 15 million views now, by the way." Lisa groaned, her face flushing. "I hate the internet." "Maybe next time don't steal a boat," Daniel said, his tone dry. "Or crash it. Or lie to the Coast Guard." She glared at him, then at Ethan. "You're both jerks. I said I'd pay for the damages. What more do you want?" "An apology might be nice," Daniel said, crossing his arms. "Or some sign you get why this was wrong." Lisa rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. It was a mistake. You're making it a bigger deal than it is." "A mistake," Daniel repeated, incredulous. "You put people in danger, Lisa. That fisherman could have drowned. My boat's a mess because of you." She opened her mouth to argue, then seemed to realize she had no ground to stand on. With a frustrated sigh, she turned and stomped off toward the dockside bathrooms, her assigned cleaning duty. The crowd parted for her, some smirking, others avoiding eye contact. Daniel watched her go, shaking his head. "She's never gonna learn," Ethan said, sipping his coffee. "Too stubborn." "Yeah," Daniel agreed. "But at least she's paying for it now." Ethan grinned. "Literally and figuratively. Best day ever, man." Daniel couldn't help but smile. The Sea Whisper would be back on the water soon. Lisa was facing consequences, and the internet had turned her into a cautionary tale. It wasn't perfect, but it was justice. Spring turned to summer, and the Sea Whisper was whole again. Daniel stood on the deck one warm June morning, the sun glinting off the freshly painted hull. The repairs had taken longer than expected, but the boat was better than ever, stronger, sleeker, a testament to his resilience. He ran his hand along the railing, feeling a quiet pride settle in his chest. Ethan joined him, a beer in hand instead of his usual coffee. "She's a beauty, man. Worth every penny." "Yeah," Daniel said, smiling. "She is." They'd taken her out that day, cruising the coast with the wind in their hair and the past behind them. Lisa was a distant memory now, her community service long finished, her name fading from the internet's spotlight. She'd paid for the repairs, reluctantly, under Mark's insistence, and moved on, quieter now, avoiding the marina like it was cursed. Mark had texted Daniel a few weeks back. "She's laying low. Thanks for not dragging it out in court." Daniel had replied with a simple no problem and left it at that. He didn't need more drama. He had his boat, his peace, and that was enough. Ethan leaned against the railing, gazing out at the water. "You think she learned anything?" Daniel shrugged. "Doubt it. People like her don't change, they just get sneakier." "True," Ethan said, chuckling. "But man, what a ride. That video's still out there, you know. People bring it up every time there's a Karen debate online." Daniel laughed, shaking his head. "Karma's funny like that. She wanted to be the center of attention. Now she is." They fell silent, the only sounds the lapping waves and the distant cry of gulls. Daniel thought back to that day in March, the panic, the anger, the absurdity of it all. It felt like a lifetime ago, but it had taught him something. Some things were worth fighting for, worth protecting. The Sea Whisper was more than a boat. It was his stake in the world, proof he could build something lasting. "Next time," Ethan said, breaking the silence, "let me drive her. I've earned it." Daniel smirked. "Not a chance." They laughed, the sound carrying over the water, and for the first time in months, Daniel felt truly at ease. The nightmare was over, the boat was his again, and sometimes, Just sometimes, karma worked fast.